Donald Trump arriving in Quebec for the G7 summit, a summit that sources indicate he was hesitant to attend. Though the president greeted his counterparts with smiles and handshakes, he is fighting public battles with some of the United States' closest allies over trade, the Iran nuclear deal, climate change, and now Russia, after Trump suggested Vladimir Putin should have a seat at the table in the group of seven.
Russia should be in this meeting. Why are we having a meeting without Russia being in the meeting? And I would recommend, and it's up to them, but Russia should be in the meeting. It should be a part of it. You know, whether you like it or not, and it may not be politically correct, but we have a world to run. And in the G7, which used to be the G8, they threw Russia out. They should let Russia come back in, because we should have Russia at the negotiating table.
Other G7 leaders disagreed, including British Prime Minister Theresa May, telling reporters, quote, "Let's remember why the G8 became the G7. And before discussions could begin on any of this, we would have to ensure Russia is amending its ways and taking a different route." Some within the president's own party also dismissed the idea. Nebraska Senator Ben Sasse writing, quote, "This is weak. Putin is not our friend, and he is not the president's buddy. He is a thug, using Soviet-style aggression to wage a shadow war against America, and our leaders should act like it." Another sore spot, trade tariffs. After exchanging barbs on Twitter with French President Emmanuel Macron and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Trump touted his ability to strike a deal.
It's what I do. It won't even be hard. And in the end, we'll all get along. But they understand, and, you know, they're trying to act like, well, we fought with you in the wars. They don't mention the fact that they have trade barriers against our farmers. They don't mention the fact that they're charging almost 300% tariffs. When it all straightens out, we'll all be in love again.
Macron initially suggested Trump may force the other 6 G7 countries to sign an agreement without the United States, though he later posted a video of a private chat with Trump, writing, quote, "Dialogue again and again, exchange, try to convince, constantly to defend the interest of the French and also of all those who believe the world is built only together," with the U.S. president before the opening of the G7. And Jake, an official from the National Security Council just spoke with CNN, telling us that the president's comments on Russia today were unplanned. We asked him about rumors that there was a potential summit between President Trump and Vladimir Putin that was being worked on. That official told us that there was some discussion about it, some chatter, but that it was not something that the National Security Council was working on internally, and that there were no logistics or details planned out for that potential summit yet, Jake.
All right, Boris Sanchez in Quebec City, thank you so much. Appreciate it. My political panel is here with me in studio. And Michelle Kaczynski, you cover the State Department for CNN. I understand you have some new reporting. The British, UK Prime Minister Theresa May, has been trying to get a bilat with President Trump, a meeting with President Trump. What can you tell us about that?
I mean, there have been rumblings for days that Trump was going to cut this trip short because European counterparts just couldn't really nail down a schedule. They felt like something was up. So now we know that the UK tried to set up a bilateral meeting between Prime Minister Theresa May and Trump, but they never got a clear response, they said. So they decided, well, they'll just try to catch up with each other on the sideline, something that's called a brush pass. And they're not really annoyed with this because Theresa May just spoke to Trump this week for 30 minutes. It was an okay conversation. They have NATO coming up. They have the Trump visit to Britain coming up. But it is kind of strange that, you know, he's talking about setting up a summit with Putin and Kim Jong-un, but he couldn't make time for Theresa May at the G7.
Right, and obviously, David Urban, you know, it's a long history of the British and the United States having what's called a special relationship. Sure. President Trump and Prime Minister Theresa May don't seem to have a special relationship.
Right, so as we've seen here in the past, this president's diplomacy is largely based on a personal rapprochement, right? One-on-one. The president is not a fan of multilateralism. He's not a fan of these big gatherings where he's one of many. The president likes to sit down one-on-one across a table and engage in a personal dialogue. So I think, you know, whether it's the G7 or the G20 or whatever group it's going to be, this president prefers prefers bilats rather than multilateralism. And I think so. You see, he's obviously got something bigger on his mind as he moves forward here, coming in this next week. I think this G7 meeting is I don't want to say, be offensive, but, largely irrelevant in a large part of things. I mean, the president, the group here is obviously upset with him about Paris, about paying more for NATO. I mean, we could go on the list of things that the U.S. and the EU and Canada don't agree about right now. And so if you're the president, he's looking forward to try to get peace on the Korean Peninsula. I think he thinks it's a lot more important.
Paul, David just said that the president probably thinks of the G7 as irrelevant. I'm wondering what you think about that.
Right. Well, right now, they are our best customers. And we have gone to economic war against our best customers and our best national security allies. It makes no sense. He is saying that Canada and the European community are a national security threat to America. That's the legal requirement to impose these tariffs. It's madness. It's bad business. It's bad national security. At the same time, David, if he prefers bilateral meetings, why not have a bilateral meeting with the British Prime Minister who has asked for one?
I don't know what the timing situation is. So I don't know.
Timing.
I don't know.
Well, part of it was timing, but it's timing because he's cutting this trip short.
Because he cut it short because
he's headed to Korea to try to get world peace.
Although that's on Tuesday,
hang out with
and this is Friday and Saturday.
It's a long.
Okay, but I will say that when you talk to his European counterparts and the diplomats surrounding them, they feel like getting away early to get to Singapore early was more of an excuse.
But he's leaving 6 hours early. He's leaving Saturday at 10:30 versus Saturday at 5. I think is what.
Well, let me ask you another question.
It's a lunch and it's a whole day.
Another thing that a lot of European diplomats were shocked at was President Trump talking about readmitting Russia into the G7. It would become the G8. Of course, look, I'm not a master deal maker, so I don't know. But David, can you explain to me why letting Russia in without getting a concession from them, such as leave Ukraine, leave Crimea, stop interfering in our elections, why that makes any sense?
No, I can't. Right, I can't. But I do know. Obviously, look again, not to pound on this, but the G20 is much more relevant in the world, right? You talk about economic, and I do understand the EU is a huge market, but to talk about global economics without India, China, the Russian Federation, Brazil, some of the biggest economies in the world, I think is a little bit
Except Michelle.
These are America's closest friends.
I understand. No, I get that part.
With whom they band together
but right now, Michelle,
to put pressure on China.
I know, but right now you'll admit there's tension because of the trade sanctions, because of ponying up money for NATO, because of Paris, because of the Paris Accord. Those are things that all get discussed at a G7 summit.
One of the reasons why, as Michelle points out, one of the reasons why people think that the G7 is important is because, for instance, when President Trump wants to pressure Russia, wants to pressure China, wants to pressure India on environmental or human rights issues, the G7 countries are the ones that do it, right? That's how you get the group together. It's Japan and France and Germany, et cetera.
That's how sanctions work when everybody gets together. And just this week, days ago, in a conversation with a former CEO of a U.S. multinational, we were talking about this and the tariffs. And he said, he agrees there needs to be a level playing field. He agrees in new approaches, like let's do this. But he said, why don't you sit down with China and say, you need to buy $500 billion worth of our goods? I'm generalizing here. But he said to do it this way, to place tariffs on our allies, he felt was a weakness and a defensive move, and by no means a proactive.
Paul, what was your take on President Trump basically re-inviting Russia into the G7?
There's no good explanation for it. There's one really bad one. And that is he has some peculiar affection for Putin and Russia. Now, Russia, not a very good customer. They have lots of tariff and non-tariff barriers to American goods. So it's not like there's a good economic reason. There's certainly not a national security reason. They committed an act of war against the United States of America, for which they have not been punished. In addition to that, they're attacking and invading their neighbors in Ukraine. They invaded their neighbors in Georgia. There's no good reason, and there's a lot of speculation that Vladimir Putin's got something on Donald Trump, and Mr. Trump is sure acting like it.
Okay, so I want to give you, David, the last word. But I want to read this. I just want to read this from Ben Sass.
World Weekly News.
Republican Senator Ben Sass responded to the president's comments saying, quote, "This is weak. Putin is not our friend, and he's not the president's buddy. He's a thug using Soviet-style aggression to wage a shadow war against America, and our leaders should act like it." Do you disagree with that?
No, listen, I don't disagree with Senator Sass. Look, I think the Russian Federation has done horrific things. I'm not going to defend. Listen, Ukraine is a proud country, was invaded Crimea. I've been there. I've been to Sevastopol. I've seen the Black Sea Fleet, right? I've visited these places before, and there's no excuse for that. But I do think they are part of the G20. And if you're looking at talking about negotiating global trade deals and talking about things, I think that's what the president's more focused on. And the G7 has nothing in common with this president, I think, on a lot of matters. And I think that's why he takes umbrage at a lot of these folks. Pushing back on Iran, on the Iran sanctions, they've been pushing back hard as well.